kick off our discussion, we're going to hear from Felicia Wong. Felicia is the president and CEO of the Roosevelt Institute, a New York-based think tank and campus network that promotes a bold economic and political vision capable of bringing the ideals of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt into the 21st century. Felicia's had a long career as a leader in and out of governments, and she holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. We've been really fortunate to have Felicia speak at previous Progress Summits, and we're very grateful to the Roosevelt Institute for partnering with us on this summit event, and also for Roosevelt's ongoing collaboration with the Broadbent Institute. Felicia is one of the most astute, eloquent voices advocating for progressive policy today, and under her leadership, the Roosevelt Institute is right at the center of all of these debates in the United States, trying to push for progress as quickly as possible. So it's my real pleasure to introduce Felicia Wong. Over to you, Felicia.
Wow, thanks, Rick. That's such a nice introduction. It's great to be able to partner with Broadbent, and I'm only sorry that we're not together in Ottawa, but I am more than happy to be speaking to you and all of your colleagues and the whole audience here virtually. So I thought what I would do is to take about 10 minutes, maybe 12, to spend some time really thinking about and talking about the history of taxation in America. You know, I'll try to do 50 years of history in 10 or 12 minutes. By the way, you can hear me, right? Is the audio all good? Okay. And then I think we're going to open it up to a big conversation, which I'm really looking forward to. And what I'd like to start with here is a kind of puzzle. You know, taxes are such a weird part of American politics, really. For at least 50 years, they've been the third rail of American politics. And so the question is kind of how we got there, why taxes are just so difficult, so centrally difficult in American politics. And then, you know, my big question now is whether we're at a moment where we can really pivot on taxation in the United States. So here I'm going to do a little bit on a brief history of the ways in which taxation has been the backbone of American conservatism since actually before Ronald Reagan became president of the United States in the 1980s. What has changed over the last decade? We really have seen progressive and not regressive taxation ideas as ascendant. So now are those ideas going to become real? And then really whether this revolution in tax thinking amongst policy experts can become law in the new Biden administration, both law and also a new common sense. I do have some reason for hope on that, but we shall see. So first, let's take a step back and look a little bit at the history of American conservatism and how that history has been intertwined with the history of really regressive taxation. I think you have to start with the tax revolt of the 1970s. That was really when taxes became core to the modern Republican conservative identity. I'm a Californian, and so I always think about California's Proposition 13, which was a very famous 1978 ballot initiative that locked in permanently low property taxes in the state and was the first and most prominent victory in an anti-tax movement that ultimately became a permanent doctrine for American progressives. Now, sorry, permanent doctrine for American conservatives. Now, this anti-tax Proposition 13 had a whole bunch of bad effects. The policy was racialized. It really secured benefits in perpetuity for primarily older white homeowners at a time when the state was becoming more racially diverse. And so this lack of revenue ended up in school cuts, public safety cuts, cuts in all kinds of social safety net spending. And those cuts fell disproportionately on younger Black, Latinx, and Asian families. Bad policy. But Proposition 13's ballot box success was enormously popular amongst older white homeowners. And that ballot box success signaled to politicians everywhere that cutting taxes was going to be popular. And that was one of the reasons that Ronald Reagan ran for president on this platform of tax cuts. And in 1981, made across the board tax cuts his signature accomplishment. And so today, the Reagan legacy is this idea that what Americans need, what citizens need, is tax relief. And this idea that tax cutting is good became both the politics and the policy of not just the Republican, but also the Democratic Party. Both sides of the aisle kind of internalized this idea that tax cuts are good and actually also good for the economy. This idea was internalized for more than 3 decades. So you had people like California Democratic Governor Jerry Brown say that Proposition 13 was a sacred doctrine. It could never be questioned. That was actually just not that long ago that he said that, 5 years ago or fewer. And you also had underlying this kind of tax populism, the economic doctrine, this supply side belief that cutting taxes was going to spur growth and that tax cuts would bring lower tax rates for the wealthy and would also create jobs, create greater efficiency. And because you'd have so much growth, you actually wouldn't have long-term losses in public services and public revenue. That's not true. We know that's not true, but that is what the sort of supply side doctrine promised. So that's the history. But here's the thing. Today, most Americans no longer believe this. They no longer think this. We actually have seen a quiet revolution in thinking about taxes, and that quiet revolution in thinking may in fact lead to a political revolution of sorts. Some of these new academic ideas on taxes have come about in the last 5 or so years, actually 10 years. Most famously, Thomas Piketty's 2014 book, a runaway bestseller, Capital in the 21st Century. In that book, Piketty made a very strong argument that wealth concentration was at the heart of many of our economic problems, that wealth concentration was going to lead capitalism to destroy itself, and that the only way out was through a global wealth tax. So since then, we've seen a bevy of new academic studies on taxation, not just Piketty, but also his colleagues Emmanuel Saez, Gabriel Zuckman, many others, have really demonstrated that cutting taxes at the top isn't associated with growth, and in many cases is associated with stagnation and with increased inequality throughout an entire economy. So these new academic ideas then led to new political ideas. In the United States, and especially during the 2020 election season, we saw big new ideas on taxation take center stage. And what was amazing to me is that all of the Democratic candidates were actually heading in the same direction. They were focused on more taxation of capital, more taxation of corporations, more taxation on income. They were especially focused on the wealthy, and really the differences between them boil down to whether you should have a single wealth tax, which is what Elizabeth Warren and then Bernie Sanders were proposing. Elizabeth's famous, teeny weeny 2% tax on the very, very, very top, which would bring $4 trillion in revenue over 10 years. That was one side of the argument. But the other side of the argument, which at the time got fewer headlines, was this idea that Joe Biden put forward, which was a $3.3 trillion tax plan focused on 10 different policy ideas. But this was also based on taxing capital gains as ordinary income, increasing the corporate tax rate, ending something called the stepped up at basis rule. We could go through all of the ideas, but basically this was also leading in the same direction as Elizabeth and Bernie's wealth tax ideas. So you see these new ideas kind of taking center stage in the very mainstream of American politics. And then the other thing you see, most interestingly to me as a political scientist, is that the public had a very new public opinion on taxation. Tax increases are actually very popular. The wealth tax polls at like 70% popularity in the United States, which is amazing. And tax cuts were very unpopular. Some of you might remember that Donald Trump's singular legislative achievement was $1.5 trillion tax cut in 2017. This was radically unpopular. Only a third of Americans supported it, and it was so unpopular that the Republicans, who hoped they could run on this tax cut in the 2018 midterms, couldn't. So you really see this sea change in public opinion on taxation, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Again, as a Californian, I remember what Prop 13 looked like. So we see something very new here. Last thing I'll say here before I turn it back to Rick, we really just see a new tax debate now, and the question is whether it's going to become real. Right? The new tax debate is not about just revenue. It's also about power. People in the United States, and I think around the world, really recognize that taxation is not just about how you can pay for stuff, but it's also about power. It's about race and about gender. It's about who is taxed. It's about why people are taxed. And it's about whether or not we can have a tax system in the United States that makes power in American society more rather than less equal. Now, of course, the big question on the eve of the signing of a $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan that was paid for by deficit spending and not by taxation. But the multi-trillion-dollar question in the United States now is whether we're going to actually see some of the new tax ideas, new progressive tax ideas, become part of the upcoming legislative proposals from the Biden team. We're going to see a lot more spending on the table, and I welcome that spending. Spending on job creation, spending on decarbonization, spending on shoring up our schools, our care economy. That's really important. The question is whether we're going to see taxation as part of that upcoming legislative package. I think we probably will. We're seeing all the signs of it. I'm actually hopeful that we'll see a great package that will include progressive taxation with progressive arguments for taxation, because I do believe that changing tax policy and taxing capital can change American politics. We saw that happen in the opposite direction in the 80s, and I'd like to see it change back.
Thank you so much, Felicia. That was a really great way to start the discussion. Taxes as power. I love it. We're now going to be joined by two other experts to shed some further light on this topic. We're really, really delighted to welcome them here today. Morris Pearl currently serves as the chair of the Patriotic Millionaires. Great name for an organization. Previously, Morris was a managing director at BlackRock, one of the largest investment firms in the world. And Morris is a key figure in a growing international movement of wealthy individuals who are actually agitating for higher taxes on the wealthy. We're also joined by Brigitte Alepin. Brigitte is a Harvard-trained, Montreal-based tax expert, author, and filmmaker. She's been listed as one of the 50 most influential tax experts in the world. You can check out her latest award-winning documentaries at brigittealepin.info. Morris and Brigitte are each going to take a few minutes to outline their thoughts on what Felicia just said, to introduce us to their thinking. Then we're going to open it up to a larger discussion. We're really happy to feed in some questions from the chat. If you want to ask a question, please just preface your comment with the word question, so I know to pluck it out of the chat, and I'll feed it into the discussion that we're about to have. So we're gonna kick it over to Morris to move the discussion forward.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rick. I think what Felicia's saying is clearly right. Public opinion is changing. We're seeing things happening. Ideas that were fringe ideas 5 or 10 years ago have reached the stage of being debated by presidential candidates in this past election season. On the table in the U.S. Senate Finance Committee right now. The window is clearly moving. And it's for a lot of reasons, but some of it is we are seeing protests in the streets. Right here, I live in New York City. We have people protesting, and they're not going to take it anymore. They're not going to put up with wealthy people paying far less taxes than people that have to work for a living. And we need to tax the wealthy people based on wealth. One of the problems with our tax system here in the United States of America is that we tax people based on something called taxable income. And for working people, it's pretty clear what that means. They get a paycheck every period, and some money's deducted from their paycheck for taxes. Fairly clear. For people like me, I haven't worked for a living in years. I don't get a paycheck. I live off investment incomes. I, have stocks and bonds, and I sell some of my stocks every once in a while. I don't have much taxable income. And what little I have is called capital gains. And I pay tax at a lower percentage than people that have to work for a living. And that is part of the problem. Middle class people, they pay a wealth tax on their wealth because most of their wealth is their houses. And we have real estate taxes here in the United States of America. But wealthy people, they don't pay a tax based on their wealth or based on anything people with common sense would consider income either. And the system is so fair. People are understanding that it's unfair, and people are insisting that their elected representatives do something about it. And hopefully that's what we're going to see.
Thanks so much, Morris. Why don't we go to Brigitte?
Thank you so much for inviting me, and congratulations for this conference. It's really important, the topic, and the speakers are amazing. Bravo. So, talking, the most important thing that I would like to discuss about this in a few minutes is a bit complicated, but I will say that in Canada, we are the same thing is in many countries. We are reaching debt. We are having debt that are so important that, of course, we are questioning ourselves. How are we going to pay for that? And the question is, should we tax more the very wealthy Canadians? Is an important question. And here in Canada, the statistics from Statistic Canada, the official statistics, shows that the average income tax rate, the effective income tax rate of the top earners, which is 280,000 people earning more than $600,000. So the effective tax rate of these wealthy Canadians is 31.7%. So if we feel Canadians that it's not enough, then we have to do something, and we have to do something soon, because all the time that we don't do something, the rest of us have to pay, have to support the missing dollars. So maybe in Canada we could, and I think in other countries it could be the same or almost the same. Maybe in Canada we could proceed with a special COVID tax. It could be a wealth tax, or it could be a minimum tax. But it's not that important which tax or other. The principle is important, that we should tax more these very wealthy Canadians that are paying an average tax rate of 31%. Also, these very wealthy Canadians are often founders of private charitable foundations, and the tax system in Canada, and it's the same in US and in UK and many countries, these wealthy private foundations, most of them are not really charitable. So because of the tax system allowed them not to be. So during the crisis, they don't really spend more on charity. So I think that if we want to do something really effective, we have to think about asking to these private foundations to spend more than the 3.5% annual that they have to spend now based on the Income Tax Act. Also, we should think about in no countries we are taxing, if we want to do something, I think it has to be green. So we should think about taxing these very wealthy Canadians that are spent, that their carbon footprint are often much more important than the average Canadian. So there's no reason now why we should not tax them with the software that we have. It's very easy to calculate a carbon footprint every year. So we should think about taxing them, and of course we should proceed with this global tax reform who can effectively tax the multinationals that they are often director or that's in a few minutes what I think about taxing more the very wealthy Canadians. And when it has been said before that tax is power, it made me think, and I'm going to end with this. It made me think about somebody in my first movie, The Price We Pay, that I worked on with Harold Crooks. There was somebody in the movie who said, when we did the Boston Tea Party, the American said no taxation without representation. And now, some 200 years after, we are back in a non-acceptable situation again. That is very super power representation without taxation. So I think maybe it's time to really think about, that we should stop that very soon.
Thank you so much, Brigitte. I really appreciate that. I want to get some quick thoughts from each of you. You've each been really eloquent in your own way, debunking some of the dumb ideas against tax increases for the very wealthy. I mean, some of the things we hear, for instance, in the United States and Canada, are things like, well, there's no point in trying to tax the super wealthy because they'll just move their wealth to another jurisdiction, and the leakage will be considerable, and you'll never get it anyway. Another argument that you typically hear as well, designing a wealth tax is so darn difficult that you couldn't possibly do it, and the amount of money you get in the door would be minimal, wouldn't be worth the bother. And for our listeners, our friends at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives just put out a dynamite report today that people should take a look at, showing that the actual amount that Canada would get from a tax on the super wealthy is double current public estimates. So the CCPA has done this great report today that people should check out. So maybe, Felicia, if we can start with you, can you debunk some of these ideas that we were bombarded with on a daily basis, that taxing the wealthy isn't going to work anyway?
Right. Well, I think there's a couple of different pieces of the overall taxing isn't worth it or taxing isn't a good idea argument. The first is that actually taxing the wealthy, whether it's corporations or the super wealthy or even the moderately wealthy, is somehow bad because it's going to inhibit growth. It's like the incentive argument. If you tax people, they won't want to start businesses. They won't want to take jobs. And therefore they won't create jobs. That was a very, very, very basic argument. That very basic neoliberal argument that came from this school of thought in the 1970s and 1980s. As it turns out, the data is very clear on that. That's just plain wrong. Higher tax rates on the wealthy, you look at all the OECD nations, multiple studies have shown that higher tax rates on the wealthy don't inhibit job creation, don't inhibit growth, and then in fact, taxing the wealthy is associated with more fair distribution of GDP and income. So that's just super clear. I think the second idea is that you can't design taxes so that they bring in money. That's also just not true. And we at Roosevelt are putting out a series of papers to demonstrate that wealth taxation is constitutional. And then maybe the constitutional argument is a uniquely American phenomenon. But the idea that wealth taxation is not constitutional. plenty of lawyers say that actually taxation is perfectly constitutional. That's the first argument. And then the second one is that it's hard to design wealth taxation because how do you value a painting? How do you value, if it's not income, if it's not literally dollars and cents, how do you actually accord value to it? And there are a lot of different ways to think about this. But let's just put it this way. Plenty of wealthy people get married and divorced every year, and their assets are, valued. And just think about that, and then, okay, we need to be able to do this for the public good on a national or international scale. There are ways to solve this problem if we want to.
Thank you for that. Maybe Morris, if we can turn to you. I've actually seen interviews that you've done on this very topic, and you make the case that actually when wealthy people or corporations are thinking about staying or leaving a jurisdiction, a couple of points on the tax rate isn't top of mind. I wonder if you can expand on that.
Well, sure. Thank you. I'm probably most famous for being in one of Brigitte's films, but I often talk about taxes. And I live here in New York City. My office is literally in the shadow of the Flatiron Building in the afternoon. We have people moving into New York City, and they're not into New York because of taxes, or if they are, they're moving to New York because we have high enough taxes to pay for all of the things that make New York, New York. People who care only about taxes, they moved to Zimbabwe, or their grandparents did 100 years ago. They're not here in the United States now, and they're not going to leave either. People are moving into the United States, into Canada, into the United Kingdom, into the high-tax Western democracies that offer services to their people and have people who can buy things, people who can shop, people who can support businesses. And that is what provides job growth. 70% of the economy here in the United States, and similarly in Canada and other countries that I mentioned, is consumer demand. You have to start a business where there are consumers who can pay for things. That means starting a business in the wealthy countries, and countries are wealthy when they have high enough taxes to support schools and hospitals and infrastructure, and enough money to have all of the things that make New York, New York, and the kinds of places that people want to live. People are starting businesses in New York, in California, in Toronto, in London, places that have higher taxes and where the governments have enough money to provide services for people. We've done the natural experiment. They've lowered taxes in parts of the United States. That has not helped. People are moving places and into the higher tax places. It's clear to me. I want to be in a place where the government has enough money to pay for things and where people have enough money to pay for things and support the kind of businesses that I can invest in.
Thanks. Thanks so much for that. That was such an important point. Brigitte, you've done a lot of writing. You've done a couple of movies on the scale and the importance of tax avoidance. And I wonder if you can fit that into the discussion. I mean, what is the scale of tax avoidance internationally? Why should we care about it as Canadians? And how does solving this problem on an international level fit into this discussion we're having?
Thank you so much for this question. But before, if I may, my second movie is called Fast and Dangerous: Race to the Bottom, and it's basically the analysis of tax competition and this new phenomenon that we see since globalization. So maybe if it's okay with you, I'm just going to give you a few comments on that as well. So I think that tax competition is real. It's not, and I think everybody agrees on this. We cannot do something and say, yeah, no, but it doesn't matter. Tax competition, it's not really there. It's really there, and I think that you know, maybe people are not moving, but multinationals, as a, you know, have a CPA background, you know, they care about tax. So, you know, it's a new thing since globalization. It's the new thing since the implementation of taxation. It's a new thing since the history of the world. So we don't really know that much about tax competition. But what we know is that there's a way to do things that you can lower the impact of tax competition. So there's, you know, like some type of wealth tax, you can lower the impact of tax competition on some type of wealth taxation. And also what I found really interesting is the fact that I never thought, never thought, and I did a paper for, you know, for Harvard on how to adapt our tax system to globalization. And I really questioned myself on, you know, so I really question myself on tax competition a lot. I never thought since the last 15 years that the US would increase the corporate tax rate. You know, it's not a small increase. It's a 21% to 28%. It's a 25% increase. So I think this gives us hope to policymakers, to Minister of Finances, that maybe for some strange reason, there's a way to face tax competition and confront it. And there's maybe it's not as strong as we thought. So I just wanted to do these few comments on tax competition, and so yeah. So of course, tax evasion is you know, we have to address it. We have to. We cannot no longer tax avoidance, tax evasion. We all know that, people that are watching this summit, that, you know, it's something that for all the reasons that we know, tax justice, equity, the functioning of the system itself and everything, we have to take whatever is necessary to stop it. So it's not easy, because part of the tax avoidance that we see is because of the system that is not adapted to the 21st century. So part of it, it has to be a global solution. So then we're back to this thing about it has to be global and tax competition. But I think that we are doing giant steps since the last few years. So I think we can hope that we are reaching a global solution facing the global tax avoidance.
Thank you very much. Felicia, why don't we get specific for a second? We have one question in the chat, which is very simple. And one of our viewers says, what is the most unfair tax break in the United States at the moment? So maybe it's unfair to ask you to choose your least favorite tax break. To give it a shot.
Yeah, that is actually a really difficult question. There's a lot of elements of the current U.S. tax code that I find egregious. I think, you know, Morris alluded to this, but not capital gains at the same rate as income, that actually is something that drives people absolutely nuts. It seems both unfair and also deeply problematic from the perspective of actual revenue raising. I think if we, I mean, the latest estimates that I've seen is that if we did tax capital gains at the same rate as ordinary income, if Morris was taxed at the same rate that sort of an average taxpayer was a working person, an ordinary working person, you know, you'd see something like $800 billion over 10 years being raised, which is a lot of money. So that's just one. But there are other things that I also worry about in the tax code, including the fact, and this is an international problem, but including the fact that we just haven't done enough to try to prevent the multiple trillions of dollars from being held offshore and basically untaxed. It's this problem of tax havens. So, but anyway, if you make me pick one, I'm going to pick the not taxing capital gains as ordinary income.
Okay, and just
seems unfair.
Well, ridiculous, and actually it's so ridiculous when you tell people about it, it's hard to believe. We actually have exactly the same problem in Canada, of course, where if you're a normal person and you're earning your income, you're taxed at one rate. If you actually derive the majority of your from stocks and other investments, you're taxed at a much lower rate. So we have exactly the same problem in the United States, in Canada, as exists in the States. Morris, why don't you take a crack at this question from the chat? Somebody wants to know why now? What's the relationship between putting more progressivity into the tax system, asking people to pay their fair share, and COVID recovery? Why is this an important discussion right now?
Well, I think it's sort of, I mean, in some ways it's by coincidence. This started a while ago. As Felicia said, we've been going one way since the late 70s and early 80s, and we started going the other way over the last several years. But I think the COVID pandemic has really brought it to the forefront. There are tens of millions of people who are unemployed and earning nothing, and yet some of us are doing far better than ever. Last year was the best year ever for the kinds of things I invest in. You know, companies like Zoom Video and Amazon and many others have had their best years in history, and the rich are getting richer and richer and richer. And yet almost a will have lost huge amounts of their income, and that's not working. And I think people have been realizing that. But it started before the pandemic. Even a year ago, just before the pandemic started, our political leaders were already talking about the unfairness of the tax system. We've been talking about this for a while, but I think the pandemic has just sort of accelerated it and made people realize how unfair it is as some of us are becoming richer and richer at this time.
Rick, can I just jump in here for a second?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. These
I think
formats are so awkward in terms of discussion, but please jump in. Yeah.
I think Morris is absolutely right. I'll also just add that, in addition, not only is it clear that our current tax system is unfair, it also doesn't contribute to health by any measure. I think economic systems that are as unequal as the system we have are, by definition, bad systems. But if all you care about is growth, it's also clear that our current tax system is not actually good for growth. And again, these multinational OECD studies that I cited make that very clear. So I think part of it is the popular question: what do people think is fair in a time of COVID? But part of it is also sort of like what the tax wonks are learning about what works in taxation and what doesn't work in taxation. And I will say that some of those very progressive tax wonks are now at the United States National Economic Council trying to figure out a better tax system. So I have some hope for that reason.
And part of it's because when you take money from rich people, it doesn't really make that much difference in their lives, whether my portfolio is a little bit higher or a little bit lower. When you have money with people who are going week to week, wondering how they're going to make next month's rent this week, that money directly affects the spending in their communities. So clearly economists call this propensity to spend and propensity to save. But if I have more money, my account balances will be a little bit higher at the end of the period than the beginning of the period, and I won't really live any differently. That's why in aggregate, people's checking account balances here in the United States is hugely up over the last year by hundreds of billions of dollars because people aren't spending as much money. Whereas half of our population doesn't have much savings at all. And if you give them more money, they'll be spending it. That is what will cause growth in our country, not giving more money to rich people. So we have to correct this inequality in order to get the kind of economic growth that'll help all of us do better.
Morris, I hope you don't mind. I think we're going to tweet out that comment of yours that taxing rich people more doesn't make a big difference in their lives, or something to that effect.
You heard it here first.
Brigitte, I love it. Brigitte, you mentioned, you started to get into some of the types of taxes that could be considered? And I wonder if you could sort of pursue it. I mean, you mentioned the idea of a COVID surtax or something, and which is a proposal that we've seen bubbling up around the world. Felicia talked about how you might think about designing a wealth tax, evaluating people's assets and then taxing that. So maybe if you could sort of explore this a little bit, like what sorts of models are out there in terms of the types of new taxes that could be considered in this, especially in this pandemic period?
Okay, I really believe that maybe we should start by focusing on the tax on billionaires. So I really believe that billionaire is a problem of our economic system. If our economic system is supposed to share in efficient manners the resource of the world, of the earth, I don't believe that having 2,100 billionaires on one side and having $1 billion living on less than $2 on the other side is an effective way to share our resource on earth. And it's not equitable as well. So I think that we should really start by focusing on the billionaires. I don't, as I said, I have a CPA background. I work with business people. I really appreciate the business environment. And it's not that I don't like, the business people, but I really believe that billionaires is not supposed to be there. It's something that it's a malfunctioning of the economic system. So if we are to focus first on the billionaires, then we can go with something as easy as a minimum global tax. It could be, when we think about tax competition, if we implement a billionaire tax, then, they will move to another country. I think that, most countries would maybe accept to implement a billionaire tax. So I think that it could be something, it could be a wealth tax or it could be a minimum tax. I really I appreciate the idea of a minimum tax. We can also implement a wealth tax, but when you look at the numbers, it gives about the same result, a minimum tax, than a wealth tax. And I think that maybe it's easier to implement. So because many countries, they have already a minimum tax in their tax system already. It's a bit easier to calculate a minimum tax than a wealth tax. So, but no matter if we use wealth or minimum tax, I think we have to go ahead with the idea, with the principle. We have to really do one or the other, but we have to do something. And I think that if you look back in history, when it was, World War One or World War Two, there's always big changes in taxation because we need money and it's time to implement new ideas. So maybe now is a good time to implement this, a billionaire tax. I really appreciate that idea. I saw a few Americans, entrepreneur going ahead with this idea. I really appreciate. I think it's time.
Thank you so much. Of course, it wouldn't be a video call without a dog barking somewhere in the background. We just have a few minutes left. Let's zero in on. I want to ask you each to pull out your crystal ball and to think about our audience today. I mean, we've got lots of people viewing this today who are activists, who are academics, who want to take this discussion from the world of ideas into the world of action. So I wonder, Felicia, if we can turn to you, and where do you see this debate headed with the new Biden administration? And what can people do in Canada, in the US, around the world to make real this notion of more fairness in the tax system?
Yeah, I really think that in one way or another, we're going to see a much more progressive tax system be proposed and likely implemented in the United States. You know, as I had said a little bit earlier, a close to $2 trillion American rescue plan, mostly focused on COVID relief, has been passed by the US Congress and it will be signed into law tomorrow. That's actually an enormous achievement that gets actually, even though it wasn't funded by tax increases, it does get at one very important part of this whole conversation, which is that, you know, government should be spending money in the service of its people. So that's actually one important kind of hurdle to cross. And I think that in the United States, we've begun to cross that now. Hugely popular $1.9 trillion rescue plan. The second thing then is the Biden folks have promised a more or less $3-4 trillion, essentially a job creation plan. Some people will call it an infrastructure plan, but it's investing $2 trillion in our care economy, raising wages for healthcare workers, for childcare workers, another $2 trillion in new industries that are more green, production, electric vehicle charging, et cetera, et cetera. So this is, you know, this is multiple trillions of dollars in actually creating a new economy, a new caring green economy for the United States. It's hugely revolutionary. Who would have thought that Joe Biden, the famous moderate, was going to be the avatar of this level of progressivism? But here you are. And I think the big debate now is whether or not we're going to need to see some kind of tax increases, more progressive taxation, in order to pay for all of that. And all signs suggest that this administration is going to want to put some taxes on the table to pay for that. Now, there's a debate amongst economists. Could you even fund a lot of this with deficit spending? You probably could, but I think where the politics are right now, you are going to see more tax increases on the wealthy, on corporations, as part of this new bill. I actually think that would be great. I just want to be clear that if we see this, I think we shouldn't only be thinking about these new tax increases as pay-fors. Of course, they're revenue, but they're much more than that. They're actually ways to restructure who pays and who gains in our overall economy. So again, this is where I see taxes as part of a shift in power, not just part of a balance sheet.
Morris, you represent a group of people, or you work with a group of people of means who are actually asking to be taxed more. I wonder if do you see this realization dawning amongst a larger group of wealthy people than in the past? Do you see this trend of the wealthy asking for more taxes? Is this gaining momentum? And what would your advice be to people watching this about how we can bring about a fairer tax system?
Well, yeah, we're gaining momentum. If you look at how many members the Patriotic Millionaires have, you can look at patrioticmillionaires.org or look at our book. And yeah, we're getting more people realizing this. And of course, it's not that I personally want to pay more taxes. If it was just me personally, sure, I could solve that problem easily. It's that we need a more fair system. As Felicia was just talking about, we need a system that decreases inequality, not increases it. We need a system that puts more of our money, of our country, in the hands of people who will spend it, not people who just see numbers going up on their computer screens, on their account balances. So that's what we need about taxes. It's not a matter of paying for something, because we have the unique advantage of issuing the dollars that we spend. It's a matter of making our system more fair in a way that will actually contribute to economic growth in our country. And so, yes, people are realizing that right now. And more people are seeing that. As we were saying earlier in the conversation, that the whole political window is shifting, And people are realizing that what happened at the end of 2017 was just this massive unfairness and total decreasing of taxes on the wealthy. And yes, I believe there is an impetus to change that. I'm hoping that our elected representatives will have the political courage and political will to take action.
Thank you. Brigitte, what can we as Canadians do to push forward this discussion, especially this next year when we're recovering from the pandemic? How can people move this from just ideas and kind of kitchen table debate into some action?
I think I think our Minister of Finance, she with the global tax reform proposed by the OECD, she's on the good, she's taking good decisions. She wants to implement the reform itself, and she's giving a chance to global tax corporations. So regarding the global corporate tax reform, I think Canadians are going in the right direction. I think we're not discussing enough about the fact that it does exist in Canada, individual wealthy Canadians who don't pay taxes. And, when we speak about the fact that we have multinationals who pay nothing or almost nothing in taxes, then, as we all said, you have some economics or some conservative economists that they have a reasoning for that. Even we agree or not, they have a reasoning for that. But there's no reason to have a billionaire or very wealthy individual who pays nothing or almost nothing in taxes. There's no economic reason for that. There's no reason. So we have to really in Canada, but not only in Canada, in US, in UK, in France, in the G7, G20 countries, we have to not only tackle the global corporate tax reform, but we have to think now about how to implement fair taxation among very wealthy individuals. And at the end, our tax system, we often separate corporate the fact that the corporate tax system is not fair, and then we think about the individual tax system is not fair. But globally, both these systems, when we take them together, then we see, a young, you see a founder of a multinationals that the multinational doesn't pay tax because they're using the tax haven and everything we know to pay nothing or almost nothing in taxes. And then this founder, the president of this company, can use different set of rules, private foundations, different set of rules, so this person can retire and not pay taxes. So globally, our system, not only in Canada, in many countries, allow an entrepreneur to not pay taxes at the corporate level when he's building his billions, and not pay tax when he retires with the different set of rules. So really, it's something that soon we have to really address the system as a whole, and do the reform as a whole, not only corporate and individual each side, but globally.
Okay, thank you so much. That was a great place to end. I want to thank Maurice Pearl, Brigitte Alepin, Felicia Wong. Thank you so much. We're almost out of time. I'm sure that people want to read more about this issue. Please check out the Roosevelt Institute online. No better resource for incredible research on this topic. Check out Patriotic Millionaires. Maurice, I think you mentioned a new book. Is that right? There we go. Shameless book plug. Excellent. And Brigitte Alepin .info. Please check that out for Brigitte's great documentaries right on point in this topic.